When it comes to epidemiological measures, I think you can see pretty easily from this chapter that epidemiology, while it sounds like, and it actually is in fact, a very broad field in and of itself, is really important to us as athletic trainers. This is again another introduction, and you'll spend more time on this in future classes, but I want to make sure that you have an introduction to it while we are talking about research and research methodology because epidemiology measures are much more than just keeping track of injuries. Okay, with some fairly simple calculations that we're going to go over throughout this lecture, it makes it very easy to help you spot injury rates and injury prevalence, to help you spot trends in what is actually occurring with your patients. As much as you'd like to rely on yourself, you can't just rely on your memory alone, okay? Because sometimes you simply just will not have all the information that you need. Um, and you just can't rely on someone like a coach or a parent simply stating, well, it seems like we are having more injuries this season, right? I'm sure you've all heard that or heard an athlete say something similar to that. You may have a coach or parent saying something like, well, it seems like we're having more ACL injuries this year. Is there something that we're doing wrong? Is there something that we can change? Okay. Without you having some sort of tangible data, you just won't know, right? You can sit there and look back and think, well, how many ACL injuries did we have with the football or the soccer team? You know, where were they? What type of field conditions did they happen under? And so on. And it makes it very difficult to actually know what has for certain occurred. Um, what this does is it helps you as you track the data through your diligent record keeping with your EMRs and so on. Um, you're going to track what injuries happened. You're going to track severity. You're going to track the patient's time to return from their injury. And if you're not, then you definitely should be if you want to be considered not just a good athletic trainer, but a good medical practitioner and a good clinician. Because this is not only going to be important for your record keeping and for protecting you as a clinician from a liability standpoint, but it's going to help you be or able to determine if there are trends that you can identify with the patient population that you might be able to change to first and foremost help prevent future injuries from occurring, and then secondarily help to decrease the severity of those injuries that will still occur. And then lastly, it'll help you to minimize the length of return for your patients after they have sustained an injury. So epidemiologic measures are really important, and they're fairly simple, as you have hopefully found through your reading of this chapter. Sports injury epidemiology is something very important to clinical practice, as I mentioned in the introductory slide. Injury surveillance systems are a part of sports injury epidemiology, and they are used, or again, they should be used at all levels. They should be used at the high school level. They're certainly used at the NCAA and professional level of athletics. But they also happen in other professional settings, like in a clinic, a hospital setting, in public service systems like police department or fire departments. They utilize epidemiologic measures in the military and even in industrial settings. I actually have a friend who's an athletic trainer, and he, for a long time, was an athletic trainer for Amazon. We all know Amazon is the place where we buy anything and everything that we want and have it delivered right to our doorsteps. But behind the wall of the internet are actual human people who have to work in an industrial warehouse to move and package our orders to be shipped to us. And this includes a lot of repetitive movements that can result in chronic injury. And the athletic trainers that work with these people certainly have a keen focus on the epidemiologic measures that help them track injuries and allow them to prevent injuries before it happens by teaching individuals how to better move and protect themselves against the recognized patterns of injury. And this all goes to help big companies like Amazon save a ton of money. So it becomes very important for the athletic trainer to track these and monitor epidemiological measures. So sports injury epidemiology is very important for our practice because it provides very important information that helps you to track current injury trends. It is absolutely your responsibility as an allied healthcare professional to track and understand those injury trends, because if you can understand them, you have the greatest chance at preventing them from occurring and ensuring that your patient population remains as healthy as possible. Um, Injury surveillance can take multiple forms, but the most basic form is documentation of the injuries. This can be on large scales with the use of national databases like the NCAA Sports Surveillance System, which I've provided you with a link here to view. And through that portal, what it does is it gives you access to the data through the data lysis center, which is the center that the NCAA uses. Injury surveillance can also be on the small scale, right? So just through your own personal documentation, your in-house systems. Like I mentioned earlier, even if you're in a small clinic or a high school athletic training room, you still need to track your patient's injuries, your assessments, the severity of those injuries, the time it takes your patients to return to play, etc. Also that you can look to see if there are trends in the data that you can spot to help you to prevent injuries from occurring in the future. It's also helpful in making evidence-based practice decisions on injury prevention strategies. Again, if you know what is occurring, where it's occurring, and when it's occurring, you'll have the best chance at determining why it's occurring by developing a clinical question to find that out. For example, why participation, or if participation on a specific type of floor, or a specific type of field, or a certain type of shoe, or some certain type of equipment is leading to a higher prevalence of some specific injury with some specific patient population. Okay, that way, if you make changes based on these trends, you can monitor to see if your change was helpful, or if it isn't, you can change it back or try something different to help lower that injury prevalence with what you have identified. These definitions are vital in sport epidemiology, and it is important that even if you are familiar with these terms, that you truly understand what they are and what they mean in relation to epidemiology. Starting with an injury is something that occurs during intercollegiate organized practice or competition that requires medical attention by an athletic trainer or a physician. This is the definition that is used by the NCAA with the sports surveillance system. But if we're talking about high school settings, it's the same thing with the word intercollegiate removed. Okay, and then the exposure is quite simply just a chance of an incident or the chance that an injury is going to occur. So an exposure might mean one game, or it might be equivalent to one practice, or it can be of greater volume by saying that an exposure is every single play that an athlete might participate in one game or in one practice. So sports like football might be one exposure per play that the athlete participates in, but in continuous sports like soccer, it might be that one exposure is equal to one game. It just depends on how it's defined by that specific reporting system. So you need to know exactly what the definitions are, because as athletic trainers, you are either going to be initiating these or tracking your own, or you are going to be asked to be participating in these surveillance systems. So prevalence is a little bit different than what we have discussed in previous chapters when we have looked at things like injury likelihood and so on. Prevalence is equal to the number of injured participants divided by the total number of participants, and then multiplied by 100 to get a percentage. So there's a little math here, but from a guy who is not a fan of math at all. It's not very difficult to do or even to understand, and hopefully you feel the same way. There's no math here that is very difficult in my opinion, especially when compared to the math that you have to do in the stats portion of this course. So what exactly does prevalence tell us? It tells us the proportion of participants that currently have an injury right now. Okay, if you have a large prevalence, you have a large problem. Okay, it's that simple. If there are a larger number of injuries, now that is where you can see a large problem. You can see the example down at the bottom of this slide where if you have 80 participants on a track team and 16 of those participants currently have an injury, they currently have a hamstring strain in this example. Well, that's 20% of that entire track team that currently has a hamstring injury. That's a problem where almost a quarter of your team has that hamstring strain. So what is going on with this team? What is causing those hamstring strains, those hamstring injuries to occur at such a high rate? Hopefully you'll have spotted that trend before it got all the way up to 20%, before 16 of those 80 track athletes sustained that hamstring strain. So now you need to also look at something like, let's say that the coach comes up to you and says, hey, we're having a lot of hamstring strains this year and it's never been this high before. Let's say you look at the data and you see, okay, this season we're at 4% hamstring strains on the team. because you've diligently tracked those your team's injuries, right? You can go back and look at previous years and see the data, and go back to the coach and say something like, "Hey, coach, based on the data that I've been so great at keeping for us, at any given time throughout the last few seasons, we've actually had about 8 out of 80, or we've had 10% of the team that's had a hamstring strain at any given time." Okay, so it gives you a way to look at and compare, not only to see if there's a big trend occurring, but also to see if there is a different trend that is occurring compared to the past. The prevalence ratio is, as I have just discussed, is just comparing one group to another and developing a ratio. That could be your team one year compared to a team a previous year. It could be your team one year compared to another team in the same year. It could be the same sport, so a football team compared to another football team, or it could be different sports, football team compared to a soccer team. All right, so we could say something like, is the prevalence of ankle sprains in football higher than the prevalence in our basketball team? Okay, if the prevalence ratio is greater than 1, the prevalence in group 1 is higher. So whatever group is on top of the equation, they are group 1, and they have a higher prevalence if the ratio is greater than 1. If the prevalence ratio is less than 1, the prevalence of group 2 is higher. So just the opposite. Whatever group is on the bottom of the equation, if the ratio is less than 1, then group 2 has a higher prevalence. So using the same example from the last slide, we already know that group 1 has a prevalence of 20%. So we add a second track team to this that has 70 participants, and 12 of those participants currently have a hamstring strain, and we find that there's a prevalence of 17%. So you find the prevalence ratio. In order to do that, we can take that 0.2, or that 20% from group 1, and then the 0.17, or the 17% from group 2, and put them into our equation for prevalence ratio to find that we get a prevalence ratio of 1.18. So we can look at that prevalence ratio that we've gotten, and we can interpret it as the prevalence of hamstring strains is about 1.2 times higher, or 120% greater in group 1 compared to group 2. So group 1 with 20% out of 80 players is higher than group 2 was with 70 participants and 12 athletes with hamstring strains. Basically, it allows us to make that comparison, not just within our own teams, but also compared to other teams, and also we can compare this nationally to see where that our track team is compared to national databases, or for high school, or for NCAA, or whatever population that you are currently working with. So incidence is a little bit different than prevalence. Incidence is the number of new injuries that occurred in a sample over a defined period of time. So that defined period of time could be per season, for example, or per preseason training camp for football, or for soccer, or basketball, or whatever. So how exactly is incidence different from prevalence? Well, prevalence is a proportion of injuries at a specific time, whereas incidence is the number of new injuries that occur in that time period. So it's really just a measure of injury rate. So how do we calculate incidence rate, or as I just mentioned in the last slide, it's also known as injury rate. So incidence or injury rate is calculated by taking the number of new injuries that have occurred in your defined period of time, and dividing that by the total number, or total exposure time. And that total exposure time is the number of participants divided by the number of exposures. So again, whatever you've defined as your exposure, per game, per play, etc. So we have our number of new injuries over our total exposure time, and then we multiply that number by 100 to get our incidence rate as a percentage. So with this, we can answer questions like the one here: how many participants are expected to acquire a new injury over the course of a season? Okay, usually this is expressed, so incidence or injury rate is expressed when it comes to athletes as a rate per 1,000 athlete exposures. So if you had 10 injuries during 450 athlete exposures during the baseball season, the incidence rate is equal to 0.022 times 1,000. From that, we can interpret that calculation and answer the question as we can expect about 22 injuries per 1,000 athlete exposures with our baseball team that we're tracking data for. So you can understand that if someone says to you that they're having a lot of injuries with some specific team in a given season, if you have the data, it's pretty easy to quantify. it's pretty easy to tell them that, yep, we for sure are having a bad season because we have 40 injuries this season and we normally only have 22, right? Or you could say the opposite. It may seem that we have a lot of injuries this season, but we actually only have 8 injuries, and we normally can expect around 22 injuries each season. Okay. Um, the one thing that I will note here when it comes to injury rate is that well, you could have a bad season one year, and the previous season you had a really good year, right? Uh, you had an injury rate that was way below what is normally expected. But when we put those 2 years or put a few seasons together, you may find out that the injury rate is right within the national mean or the mean for whatever group you are comparing it to. So you're going to have peaks and valleys when it comes to incidence rate. You're going to have some spikes and some lows in your data. So just like any other ratio, we can take an incidence rate ratio so that we can compare the incidence rate of one group to some other group just by determining what the incidence or injury rate is, and then dividing group 1 by group 2. And again, it's the same thing as the prevalence ratio, right? So if incident rate ratio is greater than 1, the incidence in group 1 is higher. If the incidence rate ratio is lower than 1, then the incidence in group 2 is higher. And then this rate ratio is per 1,000 athlete exposures. So it is very easy to do an incident rate ratio to be able to compare. Injury risk. Okay, again, another easy calculation to do, and it's very easy to determine what the risk is for the participants. Now you might have a coach or a parent or an athlete who comes to you and asks, what is the possibility of sustaining an injury if I or my athlete or my son or daughter participates in this sport? If there is data that exists, you can get the answer to this question. You can give that person asking you that question a percent chance for sustaining an injury. Okay? All we have to do for injury risk is divide the number of newly injured participants by the total number of participants, and then we multiply it by 100 to get that percent chance. So in this example, there are 86 participants on a rowing team, and 13 of them have sustained a rib injury during the season. So to calculate injury risk, we take the 13 newly injured individuals and divide the 86 total participants on that rowing team, and then we multiply it all by 100 to get our injury risk of 15%. So we could say to someone that the risk of sustaining a rib injury during the rowing season is about 15%. And you can do this based on other things too. So you could say, what's the chance of sustaining a lower body injury? What's the chance of sustaining a concussion or a heat illness, etc. Right? So if you're asked these questions, the data should be available to you regardless of what level you're at. There's a high school injury surveillance system, just like there's a collegiate surveillance system. And you can use that data to determine what the injury risk is to specific individuals. Now, I do want to mention here that the data may not be 100% accurate, as these surveillance systems are only tracking data at high schools or in settings where an AT is present. Okay, so not all high schools have athletic trainers there. So don't give the answer as an absolute certainty, but rather that based on current evidence and the data that exists where athletic trainers are, that the risk for injury is about 15% or whatever percent you find after doing your injury risk calculation. When it comes to determining relative risk, injury risk by itself only tells you what the individual risk is for an injury in your sample. Okay. The relative risk is a comparison of risks between two groups. So 2 seasons, 2 teams, 2 sports. We could look at practice versus competition. We could look at pre versus postseason, whatever, right? We can determine all of these, and all we have to do is divide the injury risk of group 1 by the injury risk of group 2. So hopefully you are seeing a pattern here with this presentation, and hopefully you've already identified this pattern through reading the chapter. But if we have a relative risk greater than 1, the injury risk in group 1 is higher, and if we have a relative risk less than 1, the injury risk in group 2 is higher. So again, if we look at this example, if you work yourself through it, we can determine that the relative risk of sustaining an injury in women's volleyball during a season is 25% greater than that of the men's volleyball team. But I just want to say as a side note here, this is a hypothetical. I pulled these numbers out of thin air. So before you go and start telling everyone that women's volleyball players have a higher relative risk than men's volleyball players, Just know that I made these numbers up, and I actually have not looked at any data to see if there is any accuracy to them or not. But again, it's just doing very easy math to find answers to various questions. This is what epidemiology is. You may be sitting there right now and saying to yourself that this is super boring and I'm sick of listening to Adam talk about all this garbage. But I really hope that you find that this information is very useful. Okay, when you can pull data off of your medical record system and you can easily manipulate and use the data to find valuable information for both yourself and your patients, not to mention any coaches or parents that you might also interact with. And in fact, many of the EMR systems out there right now, in their software, they actually have this built into them, so you can even more easily find these answers without even having to do a lot of these calculations yourselves. So these are just relative risk samples from the book, but they're also good ways for you to look at data that you see on TV or elsewhere in media. This is epidemiology in the real world, and epidemiology everywhere you look. And hopefully now you can better identify, or at least you're better equipped to identify epidemiology when you see it. So a relative risk of 9.0 tells us smokers are 9 times more likely to develop lung cancer than non-smokers. Shocker there, right? If the relative risk is 2.5, we're talking about those that drink alcohol, right? Those that consume alcohol are 2.5 times more likely to develop cirrhosis of the liver compared to those that do not consume alcohol. If the relative risk is 0.5, this means that those who consume 3 cups of vegetables a day are 0.5 times or half as likely to get colon cancer compared to people who do not consume this amount of vegetables a day. And this would be an example of a negative association. So you can see things like this all the time in the news or on social media. This is just epidemiologic data, and it is just taking the relative risk and putting it in terms that the general population can more easily understand, right? It's putting it in a way that is easier for people to use. So we've talked about confidence intervals a little bit before, and I'm not going to spend a ton of time talking about it again here because you will be, or you've probably already spent a great deal of time talking about this in the statistics portion of this class. I provided a little link to a little video here that I think is very good and will hopefully help you reach a greater understanding of confidence intervals, because I think the more you hear it, the better, right? Or at least the more you hear it explained, the more likely you are to hear it in a way that you can actually grasp if you haven't already. But a confidence interval is, again, just a measure of variability that indicates precision of the point of estimate, and it's based on a z-score. The social sciences utilize 95% confidence interval most often, and epidemiology is a social science, right? A wide confidence interval means less precision, and a narrow confidence interval means greater precision. We want that narrow confidence interval to have the greatest precision. That's going to tell us whether we can be more confident in the fact that there's less variability occurring around our sample size. So again, please watch this video, and you'll get much more on CIs with the statistics portion of this class. Relative risk reduction is also another important aspect of what we do as athletic trainers. The RRR tells us how well the treatment or intervention worked to decrease or change the risk of injury. So essentially it's telling us, did an intervention work? Okay. So a relative risk reduction of 0% indicates that the intervention did not work. Okay, there was no change or no effect. An RRR greater than 0% tells us that the intervention did have an effect, that there was a decrease in the risk for sustaining an injury due to that intervention used. Let's say you put a new type of helmet on one group compared to another group that uses a traditional helmet, and you determine that the incidence of concussion was reduced with the new helmet. So when it comes to interpreting relative risk reduction, if the RRR is greater than 25%, it is considered potentially beneficial, and more research should be conducted. When the RRR reaches greater than 50%, it's considered clinically meaningful. And although we should still be conducting research and the intervention should still continue to be developed, it can begin to be suggested for use as something that has been shown to help reduce risk of injury. So to calculate the relative risk reduction, we need to first find the injury risk for both groups. Again, injury risk is the new injuries over the total participants. Then we're going to determine the relative risk. So relative risk, again, is injury risk of group 1 over injury risk of group 2. And then we determine the relative risk reduction by taking 1 minus our relative risk, and then we multiply that by 100 to get a percentage for our relative risk reduction. So if you follow along with the example here, you will ultimately be able to interpret the relative risk reduction, and we can interpret it and say there's a 44% chance or 40% decrease in risk of injury for individuals who perform the injury prevention program in this example, which means that our relative risk reduction is potentially beneficial. So an absolute risk reduction is generally just done in specific research that is looking at things like new products or new interventions. But the absolute risk reduction represents the risk difference between an intervention group and a control group. It's the difference between them, right? So we do the same calculations to get the injury risk for the two groups. In this example here, we can see that the injury risk for group 1 was 0.10 and the injury risk for the control group was 0.18. Instead of getting a ratio here, what we do is we just subtract group 2 from group 1, or we subtract the injury risk of the control group from the injury risk of the intervention group. So in this example, we take that 0.10 and subtract the 0.18, and then multiply it by 100 to get 8% for our absolute risk reduction. So this can be then interpreted as there are 8% fewer injuries per 100 athletes in the intervention group compared to the control group. All right, if you are looking at relative risk reduction, absolute risk reduction, and you see that you have a relative risk increase and an absolute risk increase, you've got a big problem. If the injury risk is higher than in the intervention group, or if the injury risk is higher in the intervention group compared to the control group, it would be expressed as a relative risk increase and or an absolute risk increase. And it's definitely something that should signify to you that you want to stop using that intervention, right? Now, you don't necessarily have to consider this a cause and effect, but that relationship in and of itself should definitely cause some alarm bells to go off for you that the intervention may be creating more injuries than it's actually preventing. So these next few slides might get a little bit more dense and tricky to understand if you haven't gone through them in the statistics portion of this course yet, but we're first going to go through the numbers needed to treat to benefit. This is how many people you would have to treat with an intervention before you're able to prevent just one single injury for one single individual. So to find this, we really just divide, right? We calculate the absolute risk reduction and we divide 1 by the absolute risk reduction, okay? This has to do a great deal with injury prevention programs. So for example, an ACL injury prevention program. Essentially what this would do is help us look at how many individuals need to go through an intervention program for us to successfully prevent just one injury, right? So you may be asking yourselves, why the hell does this matter? Why would I do all this math to get a number needed to treat to benefit, right? Well, if we use that ACL injury prevention program as an example, let's say that we have an NNTB of 40 and we have a soccer team of 35. Well, we probably won't want to use that program because we won't see that benefit with any of our 35 soccer athletes. But if we had an NNTB of 3, then we could potentially be preventing almost 12 ACL injuries for our team of 35 soccer athletes, right? So really you can kind of look at this value as almost a return on investment. You can use it to understand if the program or intervention or whatever is going to be worth your time and your resources to benefit your patient population. So the numbers needed to treat to harm is sort of just the opposite of NNTB. This is how many people we would need to treat to cause harm or cause one injury to occur to one single individual. So to find this again, we divide 1 by the absolute risk increase. Again, you may be looking at this or thinking to yourself, why does this matter? Why would I ever want to use anything that could potentially harm my patients? Well, if we think beyond our profession for a second, we could look at something like chemotherapy, right, in cancer patients. Maybe the NNTH is 102. This would mean that we would have to treat 102 cancer patients with chemotherapy to cause harm to a single one of them. Now that, again, is a very made-up arbitrary number, but it shows that the number of patients that would benefit is far greater than the number of patients that would have harm caused to them. On the other hand, too, if we have an NNTH of 7, that means that 1 in 7 individuals will be harmed while using or after using some intervention. So is it worth it to the individual to risk being that 1 out of 7? Or is it worth it to you as the clinician to roll those dice and maybe the individual you treat has no harm or maybe they do? So that is really what we are looking for with this value. When it comes to odds and odds ratio, it's actually pretty tricky to do through a PowerPoint lecture, so I am actually going to skip over this and let you go through it with T. You can follow along with these calculations, but I'll give you a pass on this for the research methods portion of this class. So just as I mentioned before, kind of the same thing with the odds slide that we just had. I'm going to let T handle going over this more in depth with you. You can still read through the slide, but I would either like to go over this in person with you or just let T go over this as much as it is much more relevant to the statistics portion of this course.